Overview of Daring to Draw Near. Daring to Draw Near, People in Prayer by John White is a seminal work in the landscape of Christian devotional literature. First published in 1977, this enduring classic departs from traditional mechanistic manuals on spirituality. Instead of prescribing a rigid set of formulas, White invites readers to examine the authentic, recorded prayers of prominent biblical figures. By observing how individuals like Abraham, Moses, and Nehemiah approach the divine, readers gain a profound understanding of conversational intimacy with God. The book serves as both a biblical exposition and a psychological exploration of the human soul seeking its creator. The foundational premise of White's work is that prayer is less about proper technique and more about relational authenticity. As a trained psychiatrist and a pastoral leader, White brings a unique dual perspective to his exegesis of biblical text. He recognizes that human beings often project their own insecurities and psychological hangups onto God. Consequently, his writing strips away the veneer of religious performance to reveal the raw, often messy reality of human beings interacting with a holy deity. This approach bridges the gap between ancient scripture and modern psychological struggles, main themes, and underlying messages. The book is structured around specific individuals and their distinct approaches to God, which allows White to explore several key themes. Each chapter functions as a character study, analyzing the motivations, fears, and triumphs of these biblical intercessors. Audacious intercession. White heavily explores the concept of bargaining and pleading with God, most notably through the story of Abraham interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah. He highlights that God invites a type of holy audacity, encouraging believers to press deeply into their requests. Raw vulnerability. Through various figures, White underscores that God desires honest emotional expression over sanitized religious rhetoric. The underlying message is that anger, confusion, and despair are acceptable starting points for communion with the divine. The character of God, a recurring motif, is that prayer primarily serves to reveal who God is rather than just securing what man wants. As the biblical figures draw near, their understanding of God's justice, mercy, and sovereignty is fundamentally reshaped. To fully grasp White's thesis, it is helpful to understand his concept of wrestling with God. Simple explanation. This simply means that it is perfectly acceptable to struggle in prayer, to ask God difficult questions, and to persistently ask for things even when God seems silent. Detailed explanation. Theologically, this concept addresses the tension between divine sovereignty and human agency. White argues that God actively utilizes human struggle and intercessory wrestling as the ordained mechanism to enact his will on earth. It is not an attempt to change God's mind, but a transformative process where the intercessor's heart is aligned with the divine purpose through rigorous, extended spiritual engagement. Critical analysis, strengths and weaknesses. White's background as a psychiatrist heavily influences the text, providing profound insights into the human condition. He expertly dissects the defense mechanisms people use to avoid genuine vulnerability before God. Furthermore, his narrative style makes complex theological concepts highly accessible to the layperson. He reconstructs historical scenes with imaginative detail, making ancient figures feel deeply relatable to modern readers. However, the book is not without its limitations, depending on the reader's expectations. Readers seeking a heavily systematized theology of prayer may find White's narrative approach somewhat anecdotal. Additionally, because the text relies on imaginative reconstructions of biblical scenes to deduce psychological states, strict literalists might critique some of his character assessments as speculative. Evaluation, area, strengths, weaknesses. Theological accessibility translates high theology into practical everyday language, lacks a rigid, systematic theological framework for academic study. Psychological depth offers brilliant insights into human defense mechanisms and fears, may occasionally border on speculative psychoanalysis of historical figures. Practical application, highly encouraging for those feeling guilty about their prayer lives. Does not provide a step-by-step methodology for absolute beginners. Intended audience and field contribution. The primary intended audience for Daring to Draw Near consists of Christian believers who feel stagnant, discouraged, or intimidated by their prayer lives. It is particularly suited for individuals who have grown tired of rote religious practices and are seeking a more authentic, emotionally resonant connection with God. Pastors, counselors, and small group leaders frequently utilize this text because it addresses the underlying emotional barriers to spiritual disciplines. In the broader field of Christian spiritual formation, White's book holds a distinct and respected position. It helped pioneer a shift away from pragmatic, results oriented books on prayer toward a more relational, grace centered approach. By demonstrating that the giants of the faith struggled with doubt, fear, and frustration, White successfully demystified the act of intercession. It remains a staple in theological seminaries and lay reading groups alike, celebrated for its enduring pastoral warmth. Summary of key points. For approach, John White explores the topic of prayer through narrative character studies of biblical figures rather than providing mechanical rules. Psychological insight. The author uses his psychiatric background to uncover the emotional barriers and fears that prevent genuine intimacy with God. Major themes. The book champions audacious intercession, raw emotional vulnerability, and the transformative power of encountering God's true character. Target audience. Written for believers struggling with religious performance, aiming to foster authentic relational communication with the divine. Enduring impact. It remains a classic in Christian literature, praised for shifting the paradigm of prayer from a religious duty to a vibrant, albeit challenging, relationship.